Good evening from Washington. I'm Larry O'Connor, and I hope you had a great Memorial Day weekend. In the middle of that weekend, Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy announced a deal of sorts on the debt ceiling negotiations he's been conducting with President Joe Biden. He claimed victory, and the response from members of the House were, well, pretty blatant. We had one person calling it a turd sandwich and another person calling it abysmal. Problem is, for Speaker McCarthy, both of those gentlemen were Republicans. In fact, look at this tweet from Congressman Bob Good over the weekend. He said, "I'm hearing the deal is for $4 trillion increase in the debt limit. If that's true, I don't need to hear anything else. No one claiming to be a conservative could justify a yes vote." Well, let's hear directly from Congressman Robert Good out of Virginia. Thanks for joining us, Congressman.
Great to be with you, Larry. Thanks for having me again.
Now, that was before the actual details of the bill were put out. Speaker McCarthy, true to his word, has actually given you all time to look at it. It's only 99 pages. That's a huge improvement from what we've seen in the past. Now that you've had a chance to read it, has your assessment changed?
No, I've read through the bill, read through it late Sunday night after we got it, and it is terrible. It essentially adopts the Democrat position from January, February, where they wanted a clean, what they call a clean debt ceiling increase, which means no conditions, no restrictions, and it's even worse than $4 trillion because it's through January 25. That means it's unlimited, Larry. It's however much the Democrats can spend. So on the current track, it'll take our national debt from the current nearly $32 trillion to $36 trillion, and that's if we don't have any new additional emergency, exceptional, special spending beyond what we're doing just in the normal process, if you will. So it's terrible for the American people. It surrendered all of the good components of the Limit, Save, Grow bill. Democrats essentially got what they want, which is Republicans now owning, funding the full Biden agenda, the plussed up, grossed up, reckless spending, unprecedented spending of the last 2 years. Now Republicans are going to vote to continue that for 2 more years. It's just terrible for the American people.
Congressman Good, with regard to the 2-year window here, it seems obvious that both sides did not want this to be an election year issue during next year's presidential campaigns. Do they have a point there? Let's just resolve this now, and then the next president can deal with it when they win the White House.
Well, that may be true, evidently, by the actions of the leadership on both sides. But frankly, we wanted to utilize the debt ceiling as the immediate leverage point with the House majority in the bill that we had passed. And frankly, we liked that it was going to expire at the sooner of $1.5 trillion or March 31 of 24, whichever came first was in the Limit, Save, Grow bill. That was going to give us the opportunity to negotiate more spending cuts next year in return for any need to try to have to raise the debt ceiling again. Yeah. However, our plan on the Republican conservative side was to, again, pass Limit, Save, Grow, and then use the appropriations process this fall to negotiate more spending cuts. And then hopefully at some point we get to where we don't have to raise the debt ceiling anymore because we've begun to balance our budget, cut our spending, put America on a path to fiscal stability. And this bill does just the opposite. It makes, Larry, an ultimate default much more likely because we are perpetuating and exasperating the problem.
Defenders of this package, Congressman Good, would say, listen, politics is the art of the possible. We only have one chamber in Congress with a very narrow majority. We don't have the White House. We don't have the Senate. This is the best we can get. We protected defense spending, protected Social Security, and with the discretionary spending, we actually brought the spending limits back down to last year. They do have a point, don't they? I mean, if you're negotiating with kamikazes who are fine with seeing the whole thing burn down because they know the media is going to give them cover, then why don't you just sort of settle with what you can have and then make it an issue for the White House?
We really kept spending flat at 2023 levels, and which is, again, the most aggressive, bloated, reckless spending in the history of the country. We've run nearly $2 trillion deficits the last 2 years. We're on track for a massive deficit again this year. And even on the defense piece of it, Biden has currently about $100 billion for diversity programs in the military funding, and we're just going to continue that with a blank check to increase defense spending without holding accountable for how that money is spent. So we think about what Limit, Save, Grow had. Instead of canceling the student loans, $500 billion student loan transfer scheme, all we're going to do is make people start making payments again, which will save us $5 billion a month. Instead of rescinding $80 billion to expand the IRS, we're going to cut $1 billion from the IRS money that was in the IRA, the Inflation Increase Bill. There is no rescission of the hundreds of billions of dollars of climate credits. What you got those carve out for Joe Manchin to help him win an election, I guess, in West Virginia. One pipeline, that's the only pipeline that's going to get approved in this deal. This is terrible for the American people. It makes it, again, more likely we'll have an eventual default, which is to continue down the track that we're currently going, when we can no longer borrow, we can no longer fund our spending, if you will. We can no longer sell our debt. We can no longer service our debt. It'll be worse under this plan.
Yeah.
It's going to increase the national debt by about 10% in the next 2 years. Puts us on track for well over $50 trillion in national debt in 10 years.
Chuck Schumer pretty much walked away from this whole thing and said, you guys work this out, other than throwing grenades from the sidelines. So set the Senate aside for a minute. Based on what President Biden has been saying since day one, which was we won't negotiate at all. For 90 plus days, they refused to sit down at all. When he finally did sit down, he basically said, we're not going to give you anything. What makes you think, Congressman Good, that if they had walked even closer to the brink of default or even went beyond default, that Joe Biden or whoever's making decisions for Joe Biden would ever do anything that would have made you happy?
Well, the reason why we had the speaker battle back in January is because of Republicans having failed in leadership in the past, making deals with Democrats, passing most of the spending legislation, the major pieces of spending legislation when Republicans had majorities, doing it with the majority Democrat votes, contributing to us getting to $32 trillion in national debt. Now you see us doing it once again with a Republican House majority. So while we talked tough for 2 or 3 months, in the 11th hour, we just went back to the Democrats' position. Joe Biden said, you're right. He said, I'm not going to negotiate. I just want the debt ceiling raised. I'm not going to give anything on this. And guess what we just are going to, what we're going to vote to do here in the House apparently this week is to vote to raise the debt ceiling unlimited with no real concessions, no real reforms. We took the Democrat position. Why do we need a House majority if we're going to go to Democrat votes and do what Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden want us to do?
Congressman Good, 2 quick questions here, and I've only got a couple of minutes left. First, it seems like you and your colleagues who are not happy with this negotiation, you have a very strong argument, which is we should go back to pre-COVID spending. Government grew 40% during the COVID years. The pandemic's over. Why in the hell are we still spending at that level? When you say that in caucus, when you say that to leadership, what's their response?
Quite frankly, for the last 60 days, they did not disagree with us. In the conference meetings, no one really disputed the position of the House Freedom Caucus and those who drove the Limit, Save, Grow legislation that was ultimately adopted by the House before we capitulated here. But you're exactly right. We've got the most dishonest, the most partisan mainstream press we've ever had in the history of the country, at least in modern times. And yet, with that kind of reporting, the polls showed that 80% of Americans were for the Republican position of either don't raise the debt ceiling at all or raise the debt ceiling only with cuts. Only 20% were with the Biden position. What we should have done is refuse to do anything except pass the Limit, Save, Grow bill, call the Democrats bluff. All that would have done if we buffed up against Janet Yellen's X date, it would have forced a reduction in funding of the government, about $100 billion a month until we increase the debt limit. But we should have done that only with the conditions that we had in Limit, Save, Grow, or at least most of those provisions, or maybe even some of them would have been something.
Congressman Good, I only have 30 seconds. We've got Congressman Dusty Johnson coming on. He supports this bill later in the program. He'll have his say, but quickly, I just need a yes, no, or I'm not sure yet answer. If Speaker McCarthy gets Democrats to help him pass this without Republican support, will that trigger your vote of no confidence? Will you look for a new speaker?
Well, I'll just say we are focused on trying to save the country from a fiscal standpoint. This is not about the politics within the Republican Party. It's about what's good for the country. This bill is bad for the country. We're going to do everything we can to try to defeat it. What happens after that's anybody's guess, but we're trying to defeat the legislation because it's bad.
We'll take that as a not sure yet. Thank you, Congressman Good from Virginia. There's more to come on O'Connor tonight.